Hello, everybody.
Yeah, let's get to
it. glad to see you all out there again. I'm Jon Atack. This is my beloved friend, Chris Shelton.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Sensibly Speaking podcast. On my side of the pond, that's how this will be released. And yes, as always, I am more than happy to have a friendly chat with Jon Atack. It seems to be the most popular partnership on my channel in the long term. And I think as I look back on it, I think our conversations are probably, if I had to get rid of everything, I think I'd probably save our conversations, because we've touched on all the important points.
How incredibly kind. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
and
yeah,
it is true that between us, because of what we're thinking about, we've looked at this thing in a similar sort of way. Yeah. And you were saying before we started that you're gradually in your mind constructing a model which you wanted to talk about, and we'll sort of start there. We're also very likely to talk about, if we get to it, about the hundreds of splinter groups that have come out of Scientology. But let's start with some way of assessing these groups and their behaviors.
And there's a million models out there for a million different things. And I think I want to be clear that, this is a developing idea that I have right now that I've shared on my channel somewhat, and I wanted to share more because I'm interested in feedback on it and perhaps criticism of a constructive nature. This is something that's been forming for a very long time in my mind and has really started solidifying recently in enough certainty that I feel like I can, I'll talk about this a little bit. And it's not a cult model. It's not a model like the BITE model where we're trying to explain a control structure or framework, right? You have Lifton's 8 points. You have the BITE model. You've got, about a million
Cialdini.
other. Yeah, exactly.
Cialdini's 7 points,
the
vital. Yeah.
Influence, exactly. You've got a lot of ways of looking at behavior, and models are really only as useful as they serve us to kind of structure, categorize, or break down information so that we can...
They're at the threshold of understanding. They're really the beginning of understanding. I mean, I too have spent time, as you know, developing a model of the human predator by looking at the various characteristics of sociopaths and psychopaths, and I'm using those terms in Robert Hare's definition because they're different. Antisocial personalities and malignant narcissists, Fromm's model, which is the narcissistic personality disorder. And what I did was say, what's in common between these things? That's a human predator, not interested in diagnosing somebody. Right. If you see these characteristics in somebody around you, then be a little bit careful, take a step back. And it's not a way of defining behavior and saying, well, he hasn't got point number 7, therefore he's all right. As with Hare and his psychopathy model, he now has, the last 20 years, he's had this thing where if you score more than 4 and less than 30 on his psychopathy checklist revised, then you're a sociopath. If you score more than 30, up to the 40, which is the top, you're a psychopath. And looking at those characteristics, there's an overlap between the sociopath and the narcissist. And one of the differences is risks, that psychopaths don't care about taking risks themselves. In my experience of malignant narcissists, people like Hubbard, they like to make other people take risks, and they are cowards themselves.
Big time.
But
big time.
Otherwise, you get most of the other characteristics. And the thing is, if somebody's mean and horrible to you, then, go somewhere else, do something else. That would be my advice. Very profound after 40 years of studying the subject.
Yeah, exactly. Move on.
If somebody's horrid to you, leave them be.
That's right. Just move on. That's right. Yeah, and the fact, of course, that there are even within that world there are other models, right? We have the dark triad, which we've talked about at some length, because I'm particularly impressed by that categorization of people into apaths, empaths, and sociopaths, and of course definitions matter, and how we think about these things matters a lot.
And where Jane McGregor uses the term sociopath, it is covered by my term predator because you have psychopaths, antisocial personalities, malignant narcissists in that. So we really, it's a gateway to understanding to look at these things, and it's helpful exactly as you say.
Yeah.
But it isn't a sort of we're now going to do an exam and you have to memorize the points of the suppressive person or something.
No, not at all.
You don't have to always or never remember that they always or never say everything is always or never, just like L. Ron Hubbard about psychiatry, for example. Oh, gosh, he was a expressive person. Psychiatrists are always doing this. He spoke in broad generalities. Oh, no.
Yeah, something like that.
Doesn't apply to him, of course. So let's hear what you've got.
Okay, well, what I'm sort of thinking here, and this is nothing new. I mean, you and I have talked about some of this at length already. For a long time, let me just kind of lay it out, and then we can talk about it, I guess, is, for a long time I've been, I got out of Scientology, and the number one question on my mind for a very long time was, what the hell happened to me? And that question, I believe, has now been answered. I don't have any more little uncertainties or questions about what the hell happened to me as a Scientologist. That's been thoroughly...
I stepped in dog shit, and now I have to wipe it off my shoe.
Exactly. And we've in our talks and my talks with Rachel Bernstein and with so many other people on my channel have kind of really broken that down. Really clear, right? You get predators and you get, social pressures, and you get this and you get that, and that's
your empathy is grabbed hold of and utilized for the bad of the cause. Yeah.
That's right. The whole weaponized empath thing made a lot of sense to me. So that question then turned into another question, and that was and of course part of that was, and how do I make sure this never happens to me again? Well, that's where things got tougher, because that then led to, well, what is it that drives people? Why are people acting the way that they do? What drives behavior? Why, can you break it down into a few things as to what's driving people to do what they do? And I believe the answer to that question is yes. And I'm sort of forwarding this idea of, here's what I think makes people do what they do. And this goes beyond cult dynamics. This goes to any kind of behavior, really. The challenge is, this is not studied. I don't have research I can fall back on here. I have other people's theories I can fall back on for parts of this, and I'll mention those. But there's still a lot. There would still be a lot of work to do to develop this into something that would be like a scientific framework. But right now, it's just ideas. So obviously, I really glommed onto and really found affinity for critical thinking. I was really big on, and still am big on, critical thinking as a tool set, or as a discipline, as I've put it, of disciplining your mind to think carefully and logically and rationally about problems that are presented to you or situations, right? You got to understand that there's fallacious thinking. There's ways we think that are ridden with errors and problems. And we naturally tend to do that. And the discipline of critical thinking is learning how to overcome that. It's a very good thing. It's not, though, as I think we've agreed, it is not the one-stop shop for keeping yourself out of a cult, or keeping yourself away from a predator, or keeping yourself out of a bad situation. And there are reasons for that. People can lie to you and deceive you, and critical thinking isn't necessarily going to be a lie detector. And there are reasons we have to want to believe things.
Yes.
That's our contribution to that, right? Predators come along and lie to us, but we're also, one of the tricks of the trade with predators is they lie to you about something you really kind of want to be true in the first place, or it can be made to. And that's not victim blaming. It's the cleverness of the predator that they can tailor their approach to what you want. And here I'm getting into our emotional needs, right? Which we've talked about. This is very, very important. And this was not something that I learned in studying coercive control. It was actually something that really opened up trying to do this goddamn tone scale video that I've been overpromising for years. And the reason it's taken years is because emotion is a deep topic, and it's not something I wanted to give a surface veneer to. I wanted to go deep. I wanted to go, well, if Hubbard's wrong about emotions, why? Why is he wrong? What's wrong with this? And he is wrong. He's completely wrong. But
his attitude is the same always. It's a kind of Boy Scout manual Reader's Digest attitude where he's read something in a magazine and that's now the truth.
Yeah.
Because he's managed to change it a little bit so it fits in with his crazy view. I mean, he is so incredibly superficial.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Time and time again.
And that's what we find with his tone scale, right? You dive into Science of Survival, the big manual on it, and you look at the later works and you look at his redefinitions of his redefinitions, and you go, the guy really didn't, have much there. And
we never find out what he means by an emotion. So pain and propitiation and making amends and hiding are now emotions. So the differentiation between mood and emotion that is made by most psychologists is just pushed aside. So there is no depth. He just jumps in with one of those, everybody knows this, so therefore. And as we know, right, everybody knows is a broad generality. So he was suppressive.
There he is being the suppressive again. Exactly. At the end of the day, the lowest, sort of place he takes it to is it's a vibration. Right? It's a sort of a thetan vibration, and you're kind of like, okay, sure, wavelengths emanated from a thetan, and that's what your emotions are. And
sounds sciencey.
Yeah, very right. It's very super sciencey.
And ultimately, of course, the whole universe is just the vibration of the sound Om.
Exactly.
I'm not sure how that helps me, but
exactly. So Hubbard's stuff doesn't really open many doors to understanding things, but you dive into emotions, as I have through the literature, and you find that nobody's really nailed it as far as a common agreed upon, here's what it is. That definition doesn't exist. There are lots of definitions for emotion.
And you've got the big names like Paul Ekman and the work that he was doing before he fell under the spell of the Dalai Lama, which is quite amusing. And of course, Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Lisa Feldman Barrett, that's right.
Who actually has picked up an idea that was around in sociology 25 years before she talks about it. And on the cover of her book, I love this thing that somebody calls her the new Darwin of emotions. And you can actually, your fundamental hypothesis came from sociology, but because psychologists and sociologists don't talk to each other, it's quite escaped. I was fascinated by her book because I was already completely aware of the ideas she was talking about.
Her theory of constructed emotions.
Yeah, but putting aside, who originated it, it is a very interesting book and a very interesting way of looking at things. And, going forward will hopefully, be helpful to deeper study.
Yeah, well, I hope so, because I am a fan of her work, and I'm not uncritical of her work. I'm just saying I'm a fan. It makes a lot of sense to me, and the thing that I liked about one of the key things I liked about how she presents is that she makes the very lucid point that just because somebody's laughing doesn't mean they're happy. Just because somebody looks a particular way does not mean you've nailed where their emotional state is at. And that was a very, very important point because, of course, I've run into this even in my channel. Just, we have, I will do interviews with ex-cult members and we'll laugh about stuff that's not funny. And people would call us out for it in the comments. How dare you laugh at this? How dare you find humor in this? And it's like, no, that's not what we were doing. But not understanding that laughter could indicate something beyond humor. It could release catharsis, right? Emotional tension. I mean, there's a lot of things laughter can convey besides humor. And this is just one of a million examples, but it's just a point.
And humor's not necessarily about laughter. This weekend, when I put up thing with the last chat I had with Mike Render, somebody came and said, look, you've got to stop telling him off, by making these, ribbing him about, him having hunted me for 20 years and tried to destroy me. You've got to forgive him. And it's like, no, you've not understood. We come from British culture. He's from the Australian culture, where friendship is shown by making what appear to be sarcastic remarks to other people.
Right.
He also comes from a culture where he'd come around and hit me with a cricket bat if he was upset, so there's nothing for anybody to worry about.
Exactly.
He is a robust.
Exactly.
But to remind him of those things, we laugh about that because it's gone. And it is, catharsis or showing that you have overcome something. It's not quite Hubbard's you come up the tone scale until you laugh about it. I was very shocked when Michael Langone, and I'm just named him, when Michael Langone said, who was the president or the head of the International Cultic Studies Association until fairly recently, and he said at a dinner conversation that somebody's not healed until it doesn't bother them anymore what happened. And so I'm kind of going, so the guy in the foxhole next to you, your best friend, is shot dead. And there comes a time when that you don't feel anything about that. You have actually at that point become a psychopath. That's the Hubbard idea, that you'll no longer have feelings. You should always have feelings about the loss and trauma in your life, but it shouldn't overwhelm you. And
right.
So for example, if I think about my mum, who I looked after in the last years of her life, and she lived to be 94, bless her. Of course, I'm sad that she's dead. Don't be ridiculous. But it also will bring a wistful smile to me because I remember her when she was alive and, the daft things that she did. So those things, but this idea that there's some catharsis that will release an emotion, or the idea that gallows humor, the next time somebody uses the expression to you that you were pulling their leg, ask them if they know what it means. Because as far as gallows humor goes, pulling somebody's leg means when they're hanging, pulling their leg to snap their neck. You're pulling my leg, aren't you, John?
Wow.
No, not. That's where it comes from.
Wow. That's interesting. I did not know that. But again, yeah, absolutely. Right. So again, we can express, these emotions in lots of different ways. So it's been years of study for me in the field of emotions, diving deep as I could into the literature.
We're not going to get into in the last 50,000 years. There have been
no.
Okay, the last 45,000 years, this is the first advance in the...
No, we're not going to go there. I don't think that's what I've got. But
Thank God for that.
Here's what I'm thinking is... what this kind of led to was, is you go, okay, there's all these emotions and emotional experiences, and we're not even touching on, half of that right now. But this led to emotional needs. And that's different from emotions. An emotional experience is something you're experiencing in a moment. It's generally a reaction, bodily and psychologically to, stimuli, right? We can psychologically define it that way. There's other ways of defining it, but that's not actually what I'm talking about when I talk about emotional needs. Emotions are something we all experience 24/7. There's no such thing as human beings who aren't experiencing emotions. That's just, it's like saying there's human beings who don't eat. It just doesn't happen. Similarly, below all of this emotional experience or reaction comes our emotional needs. And this theory or this idea comes out of, or seems to be mostly traced back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this idea of this pyramid and basic bodily, survival, raw stuff that's at the bottom of the pyramid, and self-actualization is the top, and you got levels in between where your needs have got to be fulfilled. That's basically this idea, right? You have needs. If you're not eating, you're going to do whatever it's going to take for you to eat because you'll die if you don't.
Yeah, or you'll die. Those are the choices.
That's right.
You'll eat the bloke next to you or you'll be eaten.
Exactly. And those basic needs, first are basic physical survival needs, sleep, food, shelter, right? Which is why I say when people come out of a cult, if you don't have food taken care of, shelter taken care of, and transport taken care of, there's no use talking about anything else until you do.
Yeah.
Those are your basic needs.
And you need to sleep for 3 weeks.
Yeah, at least. And so those are really basic needs. But once you start building on that, once those are kind of taken care of, and those are not the thing that's driving your necessities, right, your needs, is you start having this next level up of our emotional needs, right? The things that make us feel that our life is satisfying, is happy, is meaningful, exactly, right? And there are different models of this, and I'm not hung up on any one model of emotional needs. I like the one I've chosen that's kind of got 9. It breaks them down into 9 different buckets, but there's different models of 4 or 5 or 10 or whatever. To me, the 9-point model makes the most sense for the way I think about things, and it includes things like community as an emotional need. You have to have a sense of community or friendship or social hierarchy or whatever you want to call it, your place in it. This is very important to people. If this is, this is the whole thing of why solitary confinement drives people absolutely batshit insane, or one of the main reasons is because there's no community. There is no sense of anybody else. And lacking that drives people absolutely nuts.
I actually have an example of this. I know a guy who was locked up by his group for 12 years without seeing anyone else.
Jesus.
And he did survive. And what he did, it fascinated me reading Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, because Frankl says you survive by, he composed the lectures in logotherapy that he was going to be giving in the future. So the life of the mind, was the thing. What this guy, Arthur, did was he composed music. And when I met him, and he's an expert in Denmark now, helping people in his 70s, brilliant guy, lovely guy. But I said, oh, please let me see the music. Let me find somebody. I don't read music, but let me find somebody who can play the music. And I'm still waiting. It was 2015 when he last promised that he'd let me have this. But yeah, that isolation, for most people, that on its own in a few days. This guy lasted 12 years. In a few days, for most people, the lack of other people will start a process which is the very model of insanity.
Exactly. And this was really quite well put together. John Oliver on his show did a thing on solitary confinement recently, and it was quite shocking to watch and horrifying, because people really will lose their minds over this. And no assertion or claim that I'm making today is claimed to be universal. There is the one thing you learn in psychology after a little while is there is no such thing as every single person's going to comply with this or want to. But I'm talking in statistical averages and majorities here, right?
The bell curve.
Exactly, right? For most people, most of the time, we can say these things are absolutely true, and I feel confident in saying that. So emotional needs are really, really, really important. Community is one. Sense of meaning, or having goals or purpose in your life, that you're fulfilling some purpose or meaning, that your identity is important. These are emotional needs. Why do we feel that way? Because that's how we're put together, right? Because that's what satisfies us as living entities, as human beings. And I'm not trying to necessarily answer the question of why we have emotional needs. I'm simply commenting on the fact that we do. It's an observable, empirical, obvious trait of every single human being. I really don't feel I'm out on a limb saying that. I think we can talk about, people in Borneo. We can talk about people in the Philippines. We can talk about people in China, and we can talk about people in the United States. They all got emotional needs, and I think we can categorize them pretty simply these ways. I don't think this is a Western idea.
No.
So these emotional needs drive, I believe these emotional needs drive a tremendous amount of our behavior. To me, this is sort of a three-dimensional model in my mind, and I don't quite have it all worked out yet in terms of what exactly it would look like to communicate best. But in the picture, the emotional needs are kind of the engine that's driving this. Whereas facts, critical thinking, which I mentioned to start with, right? Reason, our ability to think in sequences, in cause effect, in like, okay, if I do this, this will happen. That's frontal lobe activity. That's very, very necessary for our survival. But all of those facts and all of those things that we come up with are subservient to the emotional needs. And this has been something, I think, a theme you and I have talked about for years, right? People can look at a fact and deny its existence if it doesn't make them feel satisfied. If it somehow runs up against their religious beliefs, their ideological beliefs, their moral beliefs, then that fact can be rejected out of hand. Even if you stand, and I've watched this happen, I know you have too, in person and on, video, where a person will be presented with factual information. Here is conclusive proof of it. And they just look at it and go, yeah, that's nice. Nope, I don't buy it. And they don't buy it very simply because it violates some emotional need, or the third thing I'm going to mention. And that need must be fulfilled. And facts are secondary to that. Now, facts can be useful in overcoming some emotional problems and needs people have if you're bringing, if you can navigate it. That's what, you and I have talked about with interventions and that kind of thing. But it's not so simple, as I think of just sitting down and going, oh, you think this? Well, let me show you fact A and B and C, and everything's going to be fine here, right? That ain't how it works. And it's kind of funny how almost all the staging of an intervention is an effort to overcome this emotional component of belief, right? That they have to believe this is true, and you have to arrange all these circumstances to get them in a place and a time where they won't freak out on you when you try to present them some facts,
Yeah.
It's kind of the anatomy of what an intervention is, And so this is powerful, powerful stuff. So these emotional needs are kind of driving this, right? In other words, for a sense of community, for a sense of identity, I will invest, tens, hundreds of hours in research and study and looking. I will go down internet rabbit holes. This is what drives conspiracy thinking, right? I'm on to the secret path, right? And this is so emotionally satisfying, and down the rabbit hole we go. So,
and let me interject to that point that this is very much the way that some of the great critical thinkers of all time have functioned. So, the most stellar example is Isaac Newton, who's considered by many to be the father of modern science, and yet spent far less time in scientific work than he did in biblical exegesis and alchemy. This is not as well known, but the later part, most of his work was done in his 20s, the optics and the inverse square law of gravity. He's in his 20s.
Yeah.
He spends the rest of his life consuming mercury and going progressively more mad and chasing after the idea that the Bible contains a code which will reveal the proportions of Solomon's temple,
right,
which we probably think never existed now. There's no archaeological evidence for it. And that would give you all the proportions of the universe.
Right.
So that idea of, if you then think of the contemporary conspiracy theorist, they've got hold of an idea. So he's gone, well, the Bible must contain this. And you're going, why? Why, Isaac? Why must it contain it? Because I feel certain that it does.
That's right. Right there.
God told me.
And it has to, because I'm looking for this answer, and the answer must be here. So I've just got to figure it out. And to, a lot of people's credit, that's what drove a lot of the Enlightenment. Was trying to figure this whole thing out and make sense of God's plan and all of that. So
it leads us up to Immanuel Kant, the last of the great Christian philosophers, who's trying to say there must be sense in this. And then you get Schopenhauer who's saying, no, there isn't.
That's right. That's right. I might want to challenge that assumption, Mr. Kant. Exactly. Because that is an interesting assumption, isn't it? that there must be sense in all of this.
And when we get to critical thinking, that is a problem that we each of us have to resolve, which is, what is the safe first premise that is absolutely guaranteed to be true from which I can think? I've had enough people over the years tell me that they had no beliefs because they're atheists. And so I say, so you believe there's no God, and that's how you define yourself. That's a belief.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an agnostic. It's a really safe place to be because I don't have to believe anything. Atheism necessitates a belief that something doesn't exist, which is, as Richard Dawkins pointed out, is a kind of a strange place to start from. I would say that I have come to conclusions about the world. And one of them is we can understand things to the extent of human meaning. And human meaning is not all-encompassing, nor will it ever be. And when you look at somebody like Boole, who tried to put logic into thinking using mathematics, which gave us computing, ultimately, Boolean logic, but it does not work for human beings. You cannot reduce our thoughts to numerical values that can then be interrelated.
That's right.
And that's right. I accept that. And by accepting that, it means that I have a fundamental premise, which is I don't really know what's going on.
Exactly.
And after I left Scientology, I was kind of, well, we've got this true or false stuff going on. I think it's probably safer to say this is extraordinarily improbable and this is extraordinarily probable. And in between, there's a scale of probability and possibility. But that ultimately, when we say this is true and we work from a first premise, we are going to get into trouble pretty quickly.
That's right.
Because we're within the limits of human meaning. And if you sort of say, well, how about the universe has no purpose and it just happened? How about the universe is not trying to evolve so it can perceive itself through us as its sense organs, which is an amusing concept, but I don't see any proof of it. How about it's just happening and continuing to happen, and it'll keep on happening up until a certain point where it won't, maybe. And that's about what we know. And that obsessive drive, therefore, to comprehend everything, to fit everything into its little engineering box so that we know how it works, to reduce human beings to machines, will fail and does fail. That doesn't mean that we can't have heuristics which help us to understand better how we're behaving and how others behave, which is what you're seeking to do here.
That's right. That's exactly right. In fact, I would dare say that engine of innovation and creation and trying to understand is itself an emotional need.
Yes, and I think, a good friend, Joe Zimhart, would point to Ernst Becker's work on the denial of death and say, this is what's driving us. And of course, Freud had the inversion of that, which is that there are two drives in the human being, sex and suicide.
Huh.
Those are the two things we seek, libido and thanatos. And it's like, yeah, really? I like ice cream as well.
Exactly. I think there might be a little bit more to life than those two things.
Or you get the Buddha, everything is suffering. And I'm kind of going, I believed that for a long time. I don't believe it anymore. There's quite a lot that's suffering, but there's ice cream as well. I think I mentioned ice cream already.
I think
actually,
right.
I'm going to admit this publicly. I prefer iced mousse.
Oh, wow.
Which is ice cream, which is made with meringue, egg white.
Interesting.
And when you've had that, you don't want Haagen-Dazs anymore. And if you come around to my house, I'll give you some because I make it. The black currants will be ready at the end of the month, and we'll be starting to make fresh fruit iced mousse. Now I've got myself in trouble. There's going to be a queue down the road.
Yeah, you're in all kinds of trouble. Yeah. Well, I of course am more. I used to drink a lot of Coke, still do, but now I'm drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and that was Flavor Aid's greatest trick, wasn't it? Blaming Kool-Aid for Jonestown.
Yes, it was. Yes,
Flavor Aid.
it was.
So, yes, we put them out of business.
Misdirect that right now. That's right. All right. So anyway, yes, the drive for, understanding our place, and yes, we can relate this to lots of different things, including our mortality. And I think, again, we are finding that we have categories of emotional needs that are driving us because we feel that this is important. And so, and for whatever reason, and the great thing about emotional needs is you can put these different boxes out there and look at the infinite variety in which people manifest those needs. And this is where I think people get really confused, because there is this infinite variety of how these needs are met, yet we can still categorize them in these boxes and go, well, cool, but existential meaning is a need. Now, there's a million books on existential meaning and how to find it and how to go about it and what it is, but we can just look at it and go, there's a need. Community, social hierarchies, clubs, meetings, family. I got a million variations, but community, there it is, right?
Sex and drugs and rock and roll, as Ian Jury put it as well.
There you go.
It's all my mind and body needs.
So that being emotional needs, like I said, I think that's sort of a primary engine driving this thing. But then the third thing that I'm adding to the mix that is kind of new, and at least for me, but it's not new in terms of theory. It's just, for me, it's the third dimension of what's driving us. What is it that is not emotional needs and is not critical thinking or rationality or fact evidence-based ideas? What's this third thing? And that is our sense of morality. And that's a troublesome word for a lot of people, but let me simplify what I mean by it. And I use the word morality or morals because I'm drawing from Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, right, which he wrote about in The Righteous Mind. And I like that theory. I think it's a sound social science theory, even though I have critiques for how he himself uses it. But Jonathan Haidt specifically.
He's a Christian, isn't he?
He is, and he has some pretty conservative leanings, even though he identifies leftist ideologically. And he's got some interesting interpretations and takes on it. And yet, so I kind of separate that from his theory, as I think we should do, and look at his theory and go, I like this theory. This is a really good way of explaining how, like Lisa Feldman Barrett did with emotions, the theory of constructed emotions, he looks at moral foundations and how they are constructed. And I like his theory. So from that, I use the word morals. I could use other words, but the concept here is very simple, and I'm trying to sidestep an entire philosophical, epistemological argument of, oh, well, morals, what's that? What's good? What's bad? I don't care. What I'm talking about when I mention morals is what an individual himself or herself thinks is good, bad, right, wrong.
Yeah.
All of us have a map. We have our moral map, and it's complicated. It is multi-layered, and it is extremely context specific. All of us, I think, and it is my sort of summary way of throwing this out there to people, is all of us are okay, or most of us, the vast majority of us, are okay with people being killed in certain contexts. And we're not okay with it.
Not in my house, I mean.
Well, exactly, right? Or, it's not okay to just, go out and just because you're, irked at somebody to shoot them in the head. But if that person came into your home and, threatened the lives of your children, or actually, did something horrible to your family, you'd feel very correct in taking them out. You'd be a very unusual person if you didn't.
I'd rather maim them a little bit, if you give me the choice. But
right. And I'm not trying to mandate that it's an all or nothing. I'm trying to just point out an example of the relativism of our thinking in good and bad and right and wrong, and the fact that we all individually do have our lines in the sand that we have chosen. We are the ones who decide that. Maybe it's informed by our religious book. Maybe it's informed by our college classes. Maybe it's informed by our social network. Very, very much heavily influences our sense of right and wrong, good and bad.
But even if we take the notion of killing a human, that the Jain religion is absolutely opposed to killing anything. So, they sweep the path in front of them. I don't know what they've thought about bacteria, fungi, and viruses is. But and I don't particularly want to know. But you know, it's like with vegetarians. You know, I mean, do you think that plant's mother is happy that what you've done to it? You know, which leads us down this thing of fruitarians, where if all you eat is the capsule in which the seeds, don't eat the seeds because they're alive. But if you only eat the apple and keep the seeds, you haven't actually killed anything. You haven't taken life. But unfortunately, you won't have enough nutrition to survive. Right. So you probably need a bit of milk or something, which if you're a vegan, you can't have. It just gets so complicated. So with the Jains, you've got this thing of you mustn't kill anything. And with the Buddhists, there's the story about the Buddha in a past life having supposedly met a starving tigress and given his body to her to eat so that she would persist. Why he didn't go down to McDonald's and get her a couple of burgers, I don't know. But, you know, have to ask the Buddhists about that. I'm not one of them anymore. So there are, even there are extreme points of view. But as you say, if your life is threatened, your well-being is threatened, and more especially so, as you say, if your children are threatened in any way, then, you know, that the prohibition, thou shalt not kill, becomes an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
That's right.
It very quickly becomes in the Mosaic law.
That's right. That's right. And regardless of that, I mean, again, that's an example of moral relativity. But the point is, it doesn't matter to me what your moral position is. What matters to me is that you do have one. There is not, again, I feel very safe in saying that there is not one human being anywhere that doesn't have moral positions and can explain them to you. If you start talking to people in even the most basic language, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, right? You will get answers to those questions. It's part of being human to experience those feelings and those attitudes. So, and it's inherent. It's an inherent part of a social network, of a social hierarchy that you be in, right? Because you have to. How do you act around and with other people? That's where we get it from. And of course, how do you act toward yourself? What's okay to do? What's okay, you know, what's not okay to do, etc. And again, very super context specific. People can get fooled by the variety of the experiences, the arguments that get made to justify them. None of that matters in what I'm talking about. All I'm saying is people have a sense of right and wrong, good and bad, and that will drive and influence their behavior. Right? And so between these three things, and I believe in this model that facts are kind of at the bottom of the pyramid, if you know, or whatever the levels are here. And I think there's this engine of emotional needs that drives it, and it's tempered by or modified in the moment and on the longer term by our sense of right and wrong and good and bad. And I think if you understand those three things in an individual, if you kind of have a good sense of where this person's coming from, what they think is right and wrong, good and bad, where their emotional needs are at for that individual, and you have some sense of their education or some sense of their rationality or how they go about approaching things, I think you're going to have a very good sense of what that person's about and how they're going to act. And not in a sense of I'm going to predict their every move or word or any kind of nonsense like that. I'm just saying I think we have a sense of where that person's going. And I think those three things give us the best window or clue into what that person's going to do or, you know, has done, and explains the behavior. And that's kind of it. Those are the three things. And right now I kind of have it as this sort of three-dimensional model in my head of, it's kind of a spectrum sort of thing. Again, super context specific. Just because they believe that this is right in this context doesn't mean they do in this other context. People are complicated and they're affected by things differently. So I'm not trying to present this as some simpleton model of, oh, it's all so easily worked out. It's just, I think these three spheres of activity or these three things about people are the things that drive their behavior. I really don't think there's a whole lot going on outside of these things.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you that the direct needs, you know, having moved beyond the the needs to maintain homeostasis in the human body so that we stay alive, that we know that, or it is strongly suggested that once an individual comes to a level where they have all of their physical needs are met, that they're earning enough money, that their happiness will no longer be dependent upon material goods.
Right.
So once you pass a level where you've got somewhere to live, you've got clothes, you've got everything flowing through, then the anxieties and depression, which of course affect probably about a third of the people in the world, maybe more, because they don't have enough. Once you've overcome those things, you're not, by having a Andrew Tate set of Ferraris and Porsches, which seemed largely to have been leased, in fact. It wasn't that he'd earned that much money. But, adding another Maserati is not, in fact, going to make you any happier beyond the immediate moment.
Yep.
And so that fundamental level in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as you say, comes to what our emotional needs are. What is it that satisfies us? And the components within that, I see that we seek newness, novelty. There was a mock German word about 20 years ago, Neugier, the absolute necessity of having something new, which I think Amazon has fulfilled for us all now.
Yep.
The wish list. I mean, what a great idea. I can have thousands of things I'll never be able to afford.
That's right. That's right.
And the public can, people can come and look at my wish list and buy me these things, and they're not doing, frankly. And that's a bad thing. But so that we want the emotional, we want the emotion of that's called infatuation. That's our favorite. That the falling in love with an idea, a person, a thing, a creature, beauty. That we want to have that buzz, that feeling, and the word itself contains everything we need to know. Infatuation, from fatuous, to become silly. We want that kind of childlike apprehension of the world. And I think that in terms of emotional needs, there's also maturity. And, the goal which very few human beings will ever reach, in Buddhism and other sects, in Hinduism, it's moksha, the liberation, the enlightenment, the illumination, the union with God, all of these ways of describing something, which, as far as I now believe, is maturity. The point where you're going, oh, it's all right. I'm fine with it.
Yes.
Not, I now have the wisdom and knowledge of the gods, which is the bullshit that we're being sold. Or, I am a living Buddha. I am now Osho, Bhagwan, the supreme God, or what have you. But that point where you are, in fact, satisfied with being alive, where all of that, the angst of your teens is finally, and living in a society that wants to keep everybody in their teens because advertising doesn't work on grown-ups. So you've got to keep them down in a place where the infatuation can be triggered and where those emotional needs can be pandered to. So I think there's an important point in maturity, which is understanding your own emotional needs. And
yes.
That doesn't mean having a psychotherapist tell you what you ought to think or, following any model. It means coming back home to yourself and saying, what do I actually want and which parts of it am I getting? And how could I satisfy those things? And as you say, I do think, we can make a variety of models, and the idea of community, society, and that you have that spectrum there, that the psychopath doesn't need community because the psychopath cannot experience community. There's me and there's the rest of you, right?
Yeah.
So, and satisfying my desires is all that matters. That's the psychopath position, which is at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, you have, I can't remember his name, the Harvard expert on narcissists, he calls them echoists. And I absolutely disagree with, as you know, with almost everything that's said about narcissism, because it's the wrong word. But at the other end of his spectrum, he has healthy narcissism in the middle, narcissism at one extreme, and echoism at the other. An echoist is somebody who doesn't want you to pay any attention to them. They don't want you to say happy birthday. They don't want to be pointed to at all. And that's, to me, at the opposite end from the psychopath, where you've got somebody whose emotional need is to be left alone. Whereas with the psychopath, the emotional need is, I don't care about you. I'm here to exploit you. I met this guy spent 2 years getting to know me, lovely guy. And he was at university here in Nottingham, and he was one of my nephew's friends, and we spent a fair amount of time together. And at the end of 2 years, he wrote me this letter, and he said that for 2 years he'd been trying to trick me into doing something horrid. And I don't really know what he was talking about, because I'm not very observant. And it all unpacked that he'd grown up in a family where his father was violent to his mother, but he blamed his mother because she would just keep egging the man on, knowing he was going to hit her. So they'd got this destructive codependency going on. And his mother had told him, nobody ever does anything except for themselves. And so he spent 2 years, and I'm sure if he'd looked in the right places, he would have found what he was looking for, but he didn't, trying to get me to do something that would be selfish and mean, and as I say, he just wasn't looking hard enough, because I'm probably as selfish as anybody else, really. But this idea of a world where people only do that which satisfies themselves and do not care what other people feel, that's the world of the 2%. That's the world of the psychopaths. The rest of us actually do care what other people feel. And that sense of fulfilling our emotional needs, I mean, I've said often enough before that I think that there's pleasure, and I think we should include pleasure in our lives. There should be the reward of chocolate, let's face it, and nice things, but that will not be satisfying, and that pursuing pleasure for ourselves will lead possibly and probably to debauchery. Well, something I've never been able to afford, frankly.
Yeah,
no. Or to collapse, because it's not satisfying. And then you have happiness, which for me very much derives from the sense that you've contributed something, the sense you've done something, the sense that somebody else has benefited from what you've done. So you cook a good meal and people enjoy it.
Right.
I keep saying it, but one of the nicest things that's ever happened to me, and I said this at Toronto, it goes back that far, in 2015, that I had a letter from a woman who said, you probably won't remember me. And she's right, I don't.
Right.
The flow of people has been so vast and immense, and my memory is so poor. I have no idea. She said, we met 15 years ago, and I spent the afternoon with you. And I just want you to know that was the turning point in my life, that Scientology had messed everything up. And from there, I am happily married, I have children, and I have a career. And that transformation occurred at that moment. And that feels particularly good to me, because I don't feel I necessarily did anything other than encourage her, really, and say, you'll be all right, it'll be fine. I had another friend who, I stayed in her apartment for 2 nights in New Jersey. And 7 years later, I hadn't heard from her. 7 years later, she said, those conversations we had, I decided I was worth something. I went and got a degree and a master's degree. It's like, that's happiness, to know that as you moved along, that something positive happened, that you were able to be a catalyst for somebody that allowed them to then do something positive and wonderful in their life. And that, I think, there are those 2 aspects of the emotional need. We need pleasure, but we need that sense of purpose, that sense of meaning that William James said, "I will act as if what I did made a difference." He was such a brilliant man. He really was. Though he believed in ghosts and all of that kind of stuff, you know.
Well, there's
Bless him.
nobody perfect, but I
No,
think you're
and why would it be perfect or not? He set up the psychic research societies in Britain and in America, and in the end said, "I don't think that there is conclusive proof." So he was a very good scientist.
exactly.
And taking the view that this shouldn't be researched is not a good one, though. There doesn't seem to be any good research 150 years on.
I know. But I think what you're saying highlights for me the fact of that infinite variety point, and I think that's a really important one. Because one of the things that, that for me that this does is it helps me understand people and yet not take away from that infinite variety of experience, because that moral foundation is really, really an important point of this, where we see that people's ideas of what is acceptable behavior and what isn't can be quite a spectrum experience. And you
don't wave your shoe at an Arab, whatever you do.
At an arrow?
Arab.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Do not wave your shoe at an Arab. I'm telling you.
Okay,
don't show your bare feet to a Thailander.
Okay. Oh. Yeah. There you go. A highly cultural, again, highly contextual. Psychopaths, I will argue that they do have a sense of right and wrong, good and bad. It just happens to be incredibly different from yours and mine.
Yeah, what suits me is right, and what doesn't suit me is wrong.
Exactly.
And that is that point of the other, that and I don't think that we can actually have a fulfilling life without accepting the existence of the other. But then you get in a Christian culture, and you wouldn't find this in Thailand, for example, we have this idea of sacrificing yourself completely to the other. This is very much considered virtuous, though I notice that our captains of industry don't do it, and the people in power don't seem to do it at all, other than, I suppose, looking at our politicians, they work such long hours that they cease to be human beings. So there is that amount of sacrifice, but it does make them rather dangerous in their decision making. Now, Margaret Thatcher slept only 4 hours a night, and I think you can tell.
Wow. Well, I too only slept 4 hours a night for quite a while, so I know what that feels like. And again, when you're, there's another point to this that is an important point. So I'm glad we just went there. Which is that these can change and do change over time. These are not static things. In fact, they're infinite. This neurologically, we talk about plasticity, of the plasticity of the brain, how it can be rewritten, it can rewire itself.
Yeah, one part of the brain can take on a task that was formerly done by another. After a stroke, for example, there are parts that are just gone now, but the functions can all be, or almost all be regained by retraining because of neuroplasticity. You then, of course, have neurogenesis, where we are, and this was the great gift of Prozac, as far as I'm concerned. It's the only gift of Prozac, but there you go. That it showed that there was neurogenesis in the hippocampus, that new cells were being made. Until 1991, when this research was done, it was believed that after the age of 25, new brain cells aren't being made, which is a ridiculous idea.
That's right. That's right.
And it is probably through, expanding the hippocampus, because depressives have a shrunken hippocampus, or have hippocampi. There are two of them. And what's happening with Prozac, for reasons that are completely unknown, the only thing we can be reasonably sure of now has got nothing to do with serotonin. After last year's huge meta-analysis of serotonin, we don't know what it does anymore. All of this confidence, it boosts your serotonin, it boosts your dopamine, it boosts your oxytocin. No, these are all metaphors. We don't understand what any of melatonin, any of these chemicals do anymore. And that's a good place to start investigating and finding out what they actually do, and come away from our simplistic metaphors that make us sound really clever because we've used neurological terms to explain things.
Well,
there is neuroplasticity is a very important concept. I'm not criticizing use of that. It's extremely important. We change, and what's the New Zealand study where they took 1,000 kids born in 72, 73, was it? And they followed them through life. And it's actually shown that all of our presumptions were wrong, that people change incredibly through a lifetime. Jung's idea that, personality is fixed at birth.
Yeah.
As Fromm says, temperament, perhaps, but character not. So you have a temperament, but you'll develop a character. And that's up to you. That's not up to nature or nurture. It always bothered me as a kid. Why have we just got these two things? Can't I make any decisions? Can't I change things by being rational about stuff? And apparently not. But that's
apparently
we can grow up, we can mature. The other thing they found so far in that study, because of course it's still going 50 years later, is that the psychiatric designations given to these people also changed.
Mm-hmm.
So that, you're a schizophrenic, not necessarily. You might just be a schizophrenic for this period of time. And now we're going to say you've got bipolar instead, or, you've got something else. So, and that's really exciting. That's really positive news, because it means we can take responsibility. We can help people to change, and we can ourselves change, and we will, whether we like it or not.
Exactly.
I personally intend to become entirely cynical. That's my goal.
Well, it's the one constant is change, right? It's the one thing that never changes about putting on events. I can tell you that is that everything changes, and it is very hopeful, because it means that there is that nobody need be stuck in any situation or way of thinking or way of approaching life or whatever. Nor do they need to be stuck in their mental health status or diagnosis. These things can be changed. This is not to say that it is easy. This is not to say that this is universally simple or anything like that. It can often be the work of years, and this is where psychoeducation comes in, of course. When we talk about cult recovery, is what are you talking about? You're talking about changing somebody. You're talking about changing their moral foundations. You're talking about changing the way they go about satisfying their emotional needs. I happen to believe that emotional needs are pretty solid with people. I'm not saying that they don't change. That, of course, they can, but the need to fulfill those needs, right? The driver, the engine that's driving that, I don't think that changes, but I think the content of what, is going to satisfy a person certainly changes. Me, for example, years and years of working and working and working and fucking working to overcome this need to save the world. It was a need, man. It was not an option. It was, this has to get done. And this was a community and purpose and meaning and identity need for me. It filled many buckets. And it drove me to do a lot of stuff, good and bad, right and wrong. And of course, those things would be tempered by my moral compass, or that moral foundation. And when I was in Scientology, those moral foundations were very, very focused around the good of Scientology. And if it was good for Scientology, it was good, period. I don't need to argue about it. I don't even need to really think about it.
I mean, I suspect that I'm still suffering from this disorder, that I now recognize I have the empathy disorder, the knee-jerk need to help people. Not always, but in too many situations. Yes, I have taken a homeless person into my home and had him live here for 11 months, and couldn't get rid of him. And the sense in that is always, I'm not kind enough. I'm not giving enough. There's always that sense. But I intended a year ago, last June, when I reached the glorious age of 66, which is the state retirement age in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, I intended to stop doing this. I've been doing this since I was 28 years old. This is the 40th year. And it's been arduous. It's been really difficult. And I find myself caught between two thoughts. One of them is, there must be a better way of doing this. Looking at our society and the authoritarian mess that we are in, we pretend democracy, but we actually elect malignant human beings because they look pretty or they sound confident, and they then mess things up royally. They are often the least competent people among us who get to have power. Mm-hmm. And that bothers me. So at the other end of that is, this must be like, when I first picked up the Rubik's Cube, back in 1979 or whenever it was. And I went, I'm not going to look at a book. I'm not going to have anybody tell me. It took me 8 months to get right to it. There's still two moves on it that confused me that I'm not totally sure about. But it's like a Rubik's Cube, and it appeals to me in that way that there are problems in society which I now boil down to authoritarianism. The idea that some people have that they are divine and should be obeyed because of their genius, which is never true. Mm-hmm. And the idea that the majority of people, and Jane McGregor in her sociopath, empath, apath, Seach model, she puts forward this idea that there are the majority of people, about 60% of people, are followers. They're people who will, I'm not bright enough to make my mind up, and he's got a really nice suit, so he must know what to do. That I see that ridiculously simple dynamic in human society. And then I think about this documentary that I saw, and my wife actually said the other day, you really must put this on record, this thought. And she was probably just being nice to me. But I saw this documentary. I was, about 20 years old. I was in Scientology already by this time. Just a little afternoon TV documentary about a Japanese artist, a sumi painter, a guy who paints little birds and twigs and flowers and things. And he was about 80 years old, and he lived in this tiny little hut. It had got one little room that was just big enough for his cot to sleep in. And then he'd got a little place where he could sit, which just had a roof over it where he could paint. That was it. And his robe, kind of very monastic, really. And he said, well, I wake up when I feel like it. And then 80 years old, I wander through the bamboo. I live in the bamboo forest, and I listen to the bamboo. And then the inspiration takes me, and I walk back to the hut, and I grind some ink, and I write out a Buddhist sutra from memory. And then the moment comes when I can paint a bird on a bough. And then the feeling will go. And then I go to sleep. And then the next day, now, since I saw that, nearly 50 years ago, I've gone, that's how I want to live. I want to empty my mind of all of this dreck and nonsense and kludge. And I want to be able to be inspired in the moment and do the next thing. And I am a painter and a writer and a musician and a singer and all of this kind of stuff. I want to do that. But this saving the world stuff, and I know I can't do it, and I know it can't be done, but I don't see enough people trying to do it. So it's how do we get rid of the desperate obsession to do it? Right. And, I don't know. You see, any day this channel could go blank because I could kind of go, I found the bamboo forest. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. So I think, that it's an aside, but I think it's a relevant one that I still feel that I am driven. I mean, there's a distinction that's made between Confucians and Taoists. And the idea is that the Taoist, Alan Watts, at the end of his life, renounced Zen Buddhism, having infected the Western world with it. Thank you so much. Through the evil Daisetsu Suzuki. We won't get into that, but he really was an evil human being. And Watts says, it was actually the Taoist idea that I liked. So he in the last of his book, that book's Tao the Watercourse Way, he says, having realized this at the end of his life, that if a Zen monk is told to meditate by his master, then he meditates. If a Taoist is told to meditate by his master, then he meditates, if he feels like it. So the idea is with Confucians, they say of Confucius, if the mat was not straight, the master would not sit. Whereas Taoists, who cares which way the mat's pointing? I have always wanted to be a Taoist.
Right.
And indeed translated character by character over years, the Tao Te Ching, and read 50, 60 versions of the Tao Te Ching, 50 commentaries, got my head really into that thinking. And I would love to be that, but I am a Confucian. That's my temperament. This stuff is not in the right place. I want to systematize, and I want to, that's one of my emotional needs.
That's right.
That there be order, things. And to be in a world where it is so bleeding obvious that authoritarianism is what's wrong. Bullies, bosses, it's not about hierarchy. That's not wrong. It's not about status. It's not about people having rank. It's about people having authority based upon their own say-so, based upon somebody telling you, I'm the boss and you've got to do this. Mm-hmm. And the rest of us become slaves to that idea. And getting people to be willing to make decisions. Here's the fulfillment of, here's a morality, here are your emotional needs, and here's how to think about it, which is, can I grow up? Can I become responsible? Can I be helpful to the world? Can I make the world a better place by contributing something to it? Can I be a golden thread in the tapestry of humanity? Rather than, can I be a selfish monster who's got a new pair of Levi's and wears Adidas trainers and, has a Porsche, and that our society is pointed at the wrong thing? That all seems rather obvious, but there don't seem to be that many people saying it. And our society, our educational system is still positively Victorian in its attitude towards children and what we should be doing. We don't hit them anymore, which is rather good. But they are still belittled and humiliated. They're still watched. For me, the terrible thing about school was, if you ask me what's 7 times 7, I'll tell you it's 49, and then I'll check in my head because I hate to be wrong, because all school did was make me feel I was wrong about everything.
Right.
And so my normal spontaneity was just collapsed into this anxiety, which I guess after 400 videos, I must have overcome to some extent. But
that's why that's half the reason we're doing all this, right? I think it's interesting because when I hear you talk about these things and you're, and that sort of desire, that need to, to help, to save the world, to make the world a better place. I think so much of that is informed by your moral foundations, right? And because it's this balancing act for me in trying to explain this to people, because I think the morality component is a much stronger component than is generally realized. I think people think about it like you're carrying around some rule book or something, but it's so integrated with how we see. I think if anything, our moral foundations have so much to do with how we perceive the world, how we view it and how we judge it, and what we want to change about it. And I think that this is that follower thing is really important, because it's a moral as well as an emotional problem. People want to be followers. Well, half the reason for that is because they feel that's their role. That's the natural order of things. That's what's right and wrong, good and bad, is that I follow, you lead. Their father did that. Their pastor did that. Their teacher did that. Various people in their lives have fulfilled this role that to them is completely organic and natural and how things should be. And they look at you and think, you're some upstart. Who put you in charge? Who told you your morals were the ones I need to live by? If they could articulate an argument against you, they'd be like, no, this is how it's supposed to be. He says, I do. And they feel just as strongly from a moral place. And this is this is the stuff I just find this infinitely fascinating. Is that they will commit to that position, that point of view, and consider that is the natural order of things, and it's you do-gooders out there who are messing up the mix. And this is of course the perfect place for the fertile soil of authoritarianism to grow, because half the assumption is you need a leader, and you and I are kind of like, well, sometimes.
Yeah, in certain situations, and I mean, I've been absolutely fascinated by a Netflix series called Chef's Table,
Hmm.
And they've basically gone all over the world and done these beautiful vignettes, these lovely short stories about a particular chef. And you'll find, you know, just amazing, heart-wrenching stories, wonderful romances, every one of them beautifully shot. And these are people who are regarded as some of the world's greatest chefs. And you see that they're also, therefore, among the world's greatest artists. I mean, for example, the one about Albert Adria, whose brother, Ferran Adria, is usually called the greatest chef in the world. You know, that one person has arrived at this point. They had a restaurant in Barcelona for more than 20 years called El Bulli, Bulli, Bulli. And out comes Albert, his little brother, and he says, I'm sick and tired of it saying Ferran Adria and his brother. And you then find that the 1,800 recipes that El Bulli is known for were all the little brother, Albert. But he doesn't like that. He doesn't like the limelight. So you get a story turned around. It's not to say that Ferran is not a great chef. You know, he could come around and cook me breakfast anytime. I wouldn't mind. Right. But one of the things that really comes through, having watched all 6 seasons of this wonderful program, now I'm now into the French chef's table, so I have to read the subtitles and polish up my schoolboy French. But one of the wonderful things is seeing that some of these chefs do hold the traditional French chef authoritarian model. Everybody says, yes, chef, you know, you do this, you do that. But a few of them, Will Goldfarb was really interesting. He studied at El Bulli. He did wild and wacky things in New York. And then he went, what am I doing this for? And moved to Bali. And he's like, you know, as a chef, I just took chocolate out of a packet. Now I can go and pick it and I can use fresh chocolate, fresh cinnamon, you know. So he's basically said, yeah, sod it. I'm going to have a fantastic life. And being a chef's a rotten thing. That's really interesting. But the thing that's really got me is seeing those chefs who created democracy within their kitchens. They say, hey, everybody here is creative. Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. And the difference in emotional attitude in those kitchens, in those places where you see people who've given up this idea of dictatorship as leadership and have accepted that we can be a collaboration, which, of course, is how the human brain works. There isn't a little guiding self in the chiasmatic nucleus, as some believed until 20 years ago. There are 200 brain regions which are interacting in real time.
Yep. And
great human societies, you know, this idea we're at the end of history because patrician capitalism is where evolution was headed. Absolutely not. Right. Graeber and Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, most important book I've read in the last 10 years, because it just blows apart those ideas of progress and says there have been so many different human societies that were immensely successful and we should be learning from them, and we're not, because they've been pushed into the shadows. Mentioned the Enlightenment earlier. Yeah. The Enlightenment appears to have come out of the Algonquin peoples of the Americas, that Rousseau actually was tutored with ideas from a man called Condillac, and he is a historical figure, and you can trace this incredible influence that when the filthy, dirty, loathsome Europeans arrived on the east coast of the Americas, the Algonquin looked at them and went, oh no. And that they had this one major idea that was difficult to them. Within Algonquin society, the people of your tribe are beloved, and you do everything good for them. Whereas Europeans were always fighting with each other, always squabbling with each other. And that was the foundational idea of the perfect society that Rousseau came, you know, noble savage. What you haven't got written into that is, of course, if you're a member of another tribe, we will quite happily torture you to death slowly.
Yeah, I do have a little bit of a problem with the the idea they were perfect people over here and horrible
it's
people
an absolute,
over there.
It's an absolute nonsense. And Rousseau had no experience of it. And this is a man who abandoned his own children to an orphanage before we put him on any platform.
Right.
But he kickstarts the Enlightenment. but he kickstarts it from another culture, and those other cultures are there. And we can function, my talk this week with my dear friend Ira Chalef. We go back to 1977. That's how long we've known each other. Who's done this incredible work with courageous followership.
Yep.
And he's looking at his next book, and he was sort of saying, well, power tends to corrupt, and we have to have something that deals with that corruption. And I'm sort of going, I don't think it has to. I think we could grow up. I think human beings are capable of being decent. I just think there's not been a lot of it so far, and our systems need to be fine-tuned. And Ira's done more about that than anybody else alive, I think, with intelligent disobedience and courageous followership. He's given ideas to the world, which are now being used by the US military, for example. These ideas have been taken on. The European Council have accepted his ideas. Sandhurst, the military academy here, gave him an award. He's a fellow at Cambridge University, a traveling fellow, because of his achievement, quite rightly. And these ideas, as they seep into the world, pull away the authoritarianism, which is the kind of childhood of humanity. That is, the unthought out. Because when we go to the top of if it's a pyramid, and talk about critical thinking can take us to the point where, we could make a much, much better world. But we have to be careful about not putting predators in charge, which is the mistake up until today that we have made.
And continue to make. That's right. Because of, and I believe, again, that goes back to, I'm just a broken record now, but it really is going back to the perception or interpretation of the fulfillment of those needs. Yeah. When it's a choice between, because what are we doing when we're talking about a ideological race or a political race or campaign? It's a popularity contest, and what determines popularity? It's ego, it's selfishness, it's individual need, and it's communication of those needs to a populace. And that's where we get Edward, and that's where Edward Bernays enters and it comes on stage, And
the spin doctors. I mean, when New Labour came into power here in 1997 under Tony Blair, the socialist who made $25 million in his first year after being prime minister from Yale, and didn't give it away, and the Christian who didn't give it away.
Bastard.
But when they came to power, their campaign in early 97, my jaw dropped as somebody who'd been studying propaganda, coercion, manipulation for, 15 years by then. I just went, you are kidding me. Surely it's obvious to people what they're doing. What came out from that was that Philip Gould had been sent over to the Clinton campaign to find out how to do it. And that Clinton's manipulations, and you get this sort of, the other side are going to do this. I mean, James Callaghan, who was British Prime Minister before Margaret Thatcher came to power, said the Labour Party will never use a public relations agency. That didn't prove to be true.
Yeah, I'll bet it didn't.
So then Philip Gould, Derek Draper, Alistair Campbell, one after another of the spin doctors who were keeping the New Labour machine going, wrote books about it, boasting about how they'd manipulated us, how they'd cheated us, as if we were going to turn them into heroes for doing this. I think that the public perception of politics is just, and with Cambridge Analytica and the Trump campaign and so on, that they're all corrupt, that the political parties are corrupt, that their leaders are corrupt, and nobody dares stand up and tell the truth anymore. Nobody dares to say, to become president of the United States, you need $1,000 million. But we're a democracy. Anybody can become president. Yeah, as long as they've been through the vetting process of the party. So we've created a system that does not work and is not working. What we do next is another matter, and we'll probably resolve that in our next conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, yeah, it just goes layer upon layer upon layer on this stuff, because I'm talking about individual behavior, of course, in putting this little model together. And there are lots of unanswered questions for me still in terms of moving this out to a sociological model or looking at this from a group perspective. Because I can see very clearly for myself how these things are an engine of driving behavior for an individual. And part of that is that an individual is plugged into a system, any individual, unless they're in solitary confinement or, off on an island by themselves, they're plugged into some kind of network that is more than them. And we can't just give that lip service. The influence that our social connections have on us. And by social, I don't just mean our friends. I mean, your job, right? The civilization you live in, the culture you're in, the groups
TV
you're
shows
part of.
you watch.
Yeah, the TV shows you watch, exactly, right? What you find entertaining, what you find not entertaining, what you will avoid says as much about you as what you like. And these things are highly influential. And so it's not like this idea that I'm having somehow contradicts or nullifies a biopsychosocial model, which has been around since the 50s, I believe. And that's also an important way of understanding our psychology and and how we operate. So I'm offering this kind of thinking, what I'm putting together here in an effort to try to answer the question, why the hell that guy do that? It's like, well, here's some answers. Maybe there's more to it. Maybe there's other ways we can look at it. This, like emotion, you can look at it psychologically, you can look at it sociologically, you can look at it neurologically, and you will have different interpretations of the exact same phenomena at it, from these different perspectives. And so I think similarly, there's different ways of looking at behavior, but I think I like what I've put together, and I wanted to share that today and
yeah, it's good.
Get your feedback on it.
Let's say that with emotions that there's a differentiation which Lisa Feldman Barrett, among others, makes.
Yeah.
Which is there are things that you feel that are physical. So if you feel fear, then that's a cortisol response, and you do have to have cortisol to wake up in the morning. It's not a chemical you want to get rid of, but you'll get an excess of it. You have adrenaline responses. These are feelings which we think of as emotions, but there are also emotions which are contrived and constructed. And she talks about the sense you have when you finished a big bag of chips, and for any British speakers, that's crisps. You finished a big bag of chips, and you've got the satisfaction of having eaten a big bag of chips, the self-disgust at having eaten a big bag of chips, and the appetite for another big bag of chips. And shouldn't there be a word for that?
Yes.
And she offers one, which I don't actually remember. But that sense that, firstly, that emotions are just this one thing, but emotions occur in the mind and the body.
That's right.
And the body occurs in the mind as well.
Exactly.
Something that, and we then get into, in recovery from an authoritarian cult group, it's typical to look at the induction of phobia and the induction of guilt. I long ago added the induction of aversion, that a very strong way of controlling people. So the way that the Nazis controlled the German population was by telling them that the Jews are all infested with lice which carried disease. This seems to have been largely forgotten in modern times, but there was this actual aversion, physical disgust that was being sold. These people are all smelly, they're all this, that, or the other. I think phobia, guilt, and aversion as emotional, looking at that, and what is the spectrum, that a phobia, an irrational fear, as opposed to a rational fear, has at the other end of it not feeling phobic. So that when you meet somebody who comes from a different culture, you don't feel, this inherent racism, which we're told is a neurological response, which I totally and absolutely doubt. I think it's a silly experiments being performed.
Mm.
I don't think we're inherently racist. I think we're inherently xenophobic, that anything that's strange to us is strange to us, and that which has become familiar is familiar. But that doesn't mean that it means we suspect that which is not familiar, not we hate it.
That's right.
For me, again, in my I think I was about 22 and in Scientology, so you can still think, even if you're a cult member. I read a book by Shisako Endo called The Silence, which Martin Scorsese much, much later made into a film, which is quite a good film, but I felt the film didn't have the power the book had, because the book did I'd been studying Zen Buddhism. I'd studied Zen Buddhism for a year, aged 18, 19. And a couple of years later, here I am, fascinated by Japanese culture, the floating world, ukiyo-e, the arts. I've been doing copies of Japanese prints since I was about 15. I was saturated in this culture. And suddenly I'm reading this book, and it's about the persecution of Christians who would be caught and crucified in Japan after Christianity was made illegal, because that's the way they'd like to go, isn't it? Like their founder. And this barbarous behavior, which we see from the outside as Westerns in a particular way, being described by a contemporary Japanese Christian who is writing a brilliant novel about this. What really got me was that although he had a Christian perspective, and I come from a Christian culture too, I didn't recognize the way he looked at the world because he was Japanese. And there were aspects of his morality, of what would be normal to him, that seemed strange to me. And I really caught hold of that with the thought, well, so whenever I'm dealing with somebody whose worldview is different from mine, I'm going to have to take into account that it's not necessarily natural to behave in the way that, it's like my mum, she came from Nottingham, which is where I live now, but I grew up in Lichfield in Staffordshire, 40, 50 miles away, completely different dialect, of course, this being England. And so she explained to me from childhood onward that there are all of these dialects. When people come from Birmingham, they talk like it is in the Peaky Blinders, went straight up and no messing. Are you kidding now? That was about 15 miles off where I lived from. And so we had a lot of immigrants from Birmingham who, in the Black Country, who had this sort of, and so my mum said that only people in Nottingham spoke without an accent.
Right.
And then she moved back here, age 70 something. And I remember the day when she said to me, they've got, it's not true. But she had lived within this notion, which we all tend to live in. My culture, my culture of childhood is the proper way of doing things. And if somebody else, it's like, because I was taught at school that to use the word get or got is poor English. So when I read, somebody like, say, Ramachandran, the great Ramachandran, when he wrote a book without Sandra Blakesley to help him, every page is got. It's so ugly. It's so guttural. My wife, who is a teacher and, a linguist and all of this, thinks it's funny that I have this obsession. It's cultural. It's determined. I'm not complaining about the American usage of gotten, by the way, which I think is beautiful and does not exist in British English.
Interesting.
I have gotten wise to that idea.
Yes, I have. Yes, exactly. I've gotten used to your ways, John.
Yeah, you will do, gradually. And the person who must be named in this discussion, the other person, is Irving Goffman, among the sociologists. And, one of my dear friends, Bob Penny, who was the guy that set up the computers for FactNet to publish Marjorie Wakefield's books, he was such a pioneer, this guy. Nobody had done the complex programming that he did to create FactNet, the Fight Against Coercive Tactics Network, which I had the privilege of, I was the president there for a year of a non-profit. I didn't really do anything. Lawrence Wollersheim was the public face, and Bob was the engine room. Bob was doing all this stuff. Bob spent 9 years studying sociology at university and then decided to become a car mechanic and join Scientology.
Wow.
And he said that of his 9 years studying sociology, the one thing that was really valuable was the work of Irving Goffman. And Goffman had things like the mirror self, the idea that we construct a self based on the reflection of people around us, which to some extent is true. And all of our cultural traditions and the mores, they're things that bind us into that and give us that sense of community and obedience to a set of unwritten rules, and groupthink.
Right. See, and that's one of the reasons I'm talking about my ideas today and have been talking to people about them, is because I suspect that I am bumping up against work that's already been done or has been done similarly, and what you just described sounds like some of that, because I alluded earlier to this business of where do I end and you begin, and this kind of thing, and the influences we have on one another. And surely that I know I'm not, an original thinker in that. I know other people have plowed that territory.
But the thing is to alert people who have not been thinking about it to think about it. And because this is very important, understanding what drives us, what is your objective in life. There's one of the great moments in rock music that is almost unknown of. There was in America, in Los Angeles, there was a band called Touch. And they produced one album and disappeared. Don Gallucci, who founded it, was with the King's Men at the age of 15 and had a hit with Louie Louie, or Louie or Louie, as it was called when the Kinks released it here. Couldn't go on tour because he was too young. He goes down, he makes this incredible band. They can't tour the material because it's too complicated to record. Jimi Hendrix wanders into the sessions, and when they say we haven't got enough money to finish, he says, I will bankroll you. Mick Jagger walks through the sessions and gets their engineer, who makes Beggar's Banquet, the first properly recorded Rolling Stones album. Led Zeppelin go to the studio and record Led Zeppelin 2 there to get the sound. So they were, John Anderson of Yes said, Yes change direction for the Yes album because they heard this album. Now, this album is for me, statement about the American society at this time. And there's a song on it called The Spiritual Death of Howard Greer. I don't think they knew that there really was a guy called Howard Greer who was a fashion designer at the time. I think they just thought that was a funny name. And it describes the silver paper world, the house and the car and the pretty wife and all of the things that we are meant to be, which is what hippie was meant to be against, the idea of the establishment. And asking those questions and finding out and saying, well, what are we here for? What should we be doing? Should we be satisfying ourselves in some way or other? Should we be contributing something? And I think that until, and for me, that was a struggle, understanding those things, having some sense of that thing. I went all through Scientology pretty much depressed, I think, in real terms, because life was so hard and, dealing with people. And it's only really for me in my 60s that I've come to a point where I look at the world and go, I'm happy, I'm content, I'm satisfied. It won't necessarily last, and something awful could happen, in the next 3 minutes that will devastate me to such an extent. I do understand that. But coming to a point where I'm content with what I've done, I don't regret. I do sometimes think, spending 40 years helping ungrateful cult members isn't necessarily the best objective while being harassed into the ground by the cult. But it gives me a sense, that I can look down on the mass of humanity and say, that I did something that fascinated me, which is perhaps, the important part of it, that I was able to do something that really filled my mind in the attempt to understand. And that's where we still are.
That's right.
And to not be tyrants of understanding, to not become gurus teaching people how to rub yogurt on our ankles or whatever the content. They do that in India. They rub yogurt on the guru's ankles. I'm so glad that I didn't get into an Indian cult.
Oh my God.
I really couldn't have dealt with that. And I love yogurt, don't get me wrong. It's just rubbing it on people's ankles just seems strange to me, I must say. But
Yeah.
maybe that's just a cultural thing. Maybe if I did it, I would achieve enlightenment.
Or you tell yourself you did.
And kill off any Candida albicans fungus on my fingers while doing it. Who knows?
Oh my God.
But to have that, to come to that sense, as you say, of having my emotional needs are met in my current life. They really are. I have a good life. Have a nice garden as well, which is always a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's what Voltaire advised us to look after our gardens. That was his lifetimes. I finally got to it. And I feel that, I am happy with my moral sense. Mm-hmm. That, which is, I think, is a difficulty to be saying, am J.K. Rowling, when she was asked about, placing the first novel, somebody said, well, so, what did that make you feel? And she said, oh, I realized it wasn't a waste of space. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of, oh, what a bizarre, I've never thought of myself in those terms. But
well, she had a history of abuse that lent itself to thinking that way as well.
Absolutely. And I do understand it, that there are people who are responding to something traumatic or awful that happened in their lives.
That's right.
For me, it was just the search for meaning. Mm-hmm. And eventually going, doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter what the purpose of the universe is. It doesn't really matter what the meaning of life is. I've seen the Monty Python film, which explained it completely. Though I don't like the Mr. Creosote sketch, so we won't get into that. Okay. Just one wafer thin mint.
Paper thin. It's paper thin, sir.
But it arriving at some way of improving the world, and so by having a model, by having some way that people can look at this, think about their lives, then it really doesn't matter if the model's perfect. It matters that there's something that has stimulated thought in people. Bingo. Which can lead to benefit. That's so right. It's good stuff. And we're not going to say anything at all about the splinter groups from Scientology.
No, we ran out of time.
Tantalizing morsel that we will hang in front of you for months to come.
That's right.
It's like with Karen de la Carrière, the wonderful Karen de la Carrière. We've taken a furlough from our recording at the moment. But she would get to the end of each show and say, and the next time we'll do this. And we never did.
That's funny.
We'll do OT8, we'll do Bonnie Woods, what have you. So I think having those things that people have, probably in the first show we did together, we promised something and people are still waiting.
Yeah, right.
30 shows later for us to do it.
That's right. Well, Jon, I thank you for joining me for this and letting me explain my ideas to you. And I very much appreciate your reactions to them. There's a long way to go with this, and we'll see what I do with it. But I feel in my mind, I feel like I've got something that makes a lot of sense, and also helps me help other people, because this is something that I've been using in my consultation with people, which is not therapy. I'm not trying to even go in any sort of faux therapy direction.
I never did any of that either. It's information. It's getting people to think. The therapy. Right. I'm not at all sure about psychotherapy. Full stop. Given the mad people who devised it, like Freud and Jung.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough on that. Yeah, no. All I try to do is help people understand, through understanding, come to a place where they can think and come up with their own answers for why they did what they did and why things happen the way they did. And I think that that's the only place we can get those answers from, is from ourselves. And so, because we're the ones who did it and it happened to us. So how is anybody else going to possibly understand to the depth and degree we can? But how can we understand if we don't have the information that we need to understand? And that's what I think that my role is in this, Yeah,
it's in making somebody else the authority in their own life, which doesn't mean getting them to the point where they think they know everything. Far from it.
That's right.
But getting to the point where they know where they're headed. They know they've got some idea of why they want to go there, and they've got some idea of who they want to travel with.
That's right. Exactly right. So on that happy note, I guess we'll wrap up for this week.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure and a delight as
Awesome.
always.
As always, exactly. All right, folks out there, if you are not subscribed to Jon's channel and to mine, subscribe. And if you are not sharing this work, get to sharing. And if you are not, if you have not read Jon's books, by the way, read them. If you've not read my book, Scientology, It Is Xenu, read it. I'm sure you'll find it fascinating. And of course, if you want to consult with me, you can contact me via my email and through my channel, and I'd be more than happy to help you out. So,
Great.
see you guys next week.